Thank you, Brad, and welcome everyone. It's good to see all of you here today for the EEI Fall Forum. I think this is our third year now of having a Fall Forum. It's become a little bit routine, so that's a good thing. I'm going to be talking about pavement management programs and how pavement management programs can be the centerpiece of your strategy for stretching your infrastructure dollars. We're going to start with just a general discussion about why pavement management programs are important. And then we'll get into some of the technical aspects of pavement condition. We'll also talk about pavement maintenance, the importance of pavement maintenance and the role in extending the life cycle of your pavement. And then we'll add costs to that. And we'll look at how we can optimize our roadway programs using pavement management. So why is pavement management programs important? Well, first of all, we're looking at one of the highest valued assets that a community has when we're looking at the pavement. And we're going to be talking today mostly about asphalt, but same concepts apply to concrete. So these assets also, we know that in maintaining these assets, we have to be active. We don't just put down an asphalt pavement and then go away from it for 20 years. There is maintenance that needs to be done. And so with these two things in mind, we're looking at trying to optimize our limited resources, right? So how can we extend the life cycle of our pavement by being proactive in our maintenance and being judicial in our economy that we are spending, the dollars that we're spending. The other thing that's nice about pavement management programs is that they provide an objective result. Many communities in our region are using this on an annual basis to support their roadway programs. And in fact, the boards and councils have become routinely aware of them, and they know that this is part of the routine, the annual routine. So they expect to see the pavement management program as part of the rationale for this year's annual program. So the idea that we're going to be pursuing here is that pavement management programs can produce optimum funding. And on this slide, you see the green curve represents the deterioration in condition over time or as a pavement gets older. And if we allow that deterioration to go down to a particular level where the road is in very poor condition, and then we resurface it, we would have a curve, a deterioration curve like you see there. The idea is that preventative maintenance can be done incrementally to extend the life expectancy at much lower life cycle costs, okay? And that's shown with the white curve there. So we're going to explore this in terms of how we can measure the condition, what are the types of programs that we use to extend the life cycle, and then how can we optimize that. So pavement management programs help us decide what to do, where to do it, when to do it, and how much it's going to cost. So that's kind of a forward viewpoint of the process, right? What are we going to do, where, and when? And then based on that, how much is it going to cost? One of the advantages of pavement management programs is that through the software applications, we can actually do the reverse. So we can actually decide how much we want to spend, and then the programs will tell us what, where, and when we should spend that. Okay, so that's part of the power of this, is being able to run different scenarios using the software programs. The Pavement Condition Index describes the level of service over time. On this graph, we see just a simple line which represents pavement condition over time. And you see in the upper left of the graph, the pavement, when it's first put down, is at a very high level of service. And then over time, it deteriorates, and then there's kind of a break point where it breaks off and it really declines. And so that we're going to talk about that, and that break point is very important to us. But being able to measure that pavement condition over time is the fundamental idea in a pavement management program. And measuring pavement condition is not new. It's been done for a long time. In fact, there's an ASTM standard, and in times past, and maybe even today in some communities, there are engineering techs who know how to do these surveys, and they go out and they look at a representative plot or a patch of the roadway, and they fill out the form. And you can imagine how much time that would take for a community with 30, 50, 100 miles of roadway. So this is kind of the old style. It was pretty subjective, and it takes a lot of time, and it's only incremental. It's only done over certain representative areas. Today's technology uses lasers and GPS and other video technology to get a continuous record of the surface condition. And there are deflectometers which can measure how the asphalt responds to an impact that will give you an idea of the condition of the base, the sub-base. So we can identify the surface condition and the subsurface condition. In most instances, we talk about the surface or overall, and overall is surface and subsurface. So that's important to recognize when you're looking at a pavement condition index map. Is this map surface only, or is it overall, which includes the subsurface? The data acquired there is then processed, and each block in the survey is then assigned a pavement condition. And you see there on the right the qualitative and rank from 0 to 100, and then qualitatively from very poor to excellent. And we always use these same colors, and these colors carry through, so you'll see them on maps and other displays. So what does a pavement condition index look like in terms of practical matters? Well, this is a very good, maybe a PCI of 95. A good, that might be represented by about a 70. And then a fair. And you can see in the fair now your centerline crack has really developed, and then you get some rutting on the sides where the traffic is going. And then into your poor, which is a PCI of 45, and then very poor, which is down below that 45. So in most instances, that fair is about the cutoff for where we want to start looking at perhaps resurfacing. We don't want to let it get into the very poor condition, right? Because that's allowing moisture into the base, which is creating a problem that even resurfacing won't address. So this is an example of a pavement condition index for a town, for a village. It's Elk Grove Village. And you can see the different streets are shown in color. And then the scale is shown. And then there's a pie chart which shows the percentage of the roadway, which is excellent, good, fair, and so on. Notice also the average surface condition is 75.8. And usually in these, we will look at that average number and how that average number varies over time as we run through the various future scenarios. So this is a snapshot in time. This is current conditions, and it is just the surface condition. So how much does all that cost? Well, it depends. And there's quite a range in terms of cost, dollars per mile, $200 to $1,200. That's quite a variation. So what are the variables? Well, one of the most important variables is the miles of the survey. There's a very high mobilization charge. So if you only have 40 or 50 miles, your cost per mile is going to be relatively high, probably near the middle of this range. If you've got the 700-800 miles to up to 1,000, you can expect to have a much lower cost. Then it's a matter of what technology is being used. There's actually smartphone technology today where you can put a smartphone in your dashboard and have a continuous record. And they have algorithms that will interpret the cracking in the roadway. The type of data that's collected, if it's surface only, or if you're also going to include the subsurface information, and whether or not you're going to include some of your other infrastructure, right? Because there's cameras, you can have those cameras pointed to your right-of-way, and you can pick up trees or signs or other things, and they have algorithms, artificial intelligent algorithms that can identify these signs. And then, of course, the processing and data analysis and reporting. And many times you'll hire a contractor based on a bid and then use that data either in-house or with your engineering firm to interpret that and help you in developing your 5- and 10-year capital improvement programs. One thing that can be done with that first snapshot, if you have the date in which the surface was last resurfaced, you can plot the age versus the PCI for that first condition survey. And you'll see that community-wide deterioration curve. Now, it's kind of subjective at this point. It's broad throughout the whole community, and so that's why the points are kind of all around, but it will give you a good idea on average how things are deteriorating. The best case is when you've gone and done several surveys and you have the results on a block of roadway, and you can plot them over time, typically 3 to 5 year increments in these surveys. So you can imagine if you could see a new pavement surface and how that deteriorated over time, that would be very beneficial in terms of predicting when maintenance or resurfacing would be needed. The timely maintenance helps extend the useful life of our pavement. As I mentioned, that normal degradation curve, resurfacing and then going back to the degradation with no pavement maintenance is shown by that curve. And what we would hope to accomplish is to intervene in that deterioration before we reach that break point and keep our pavement condition up and extend the overall life cycle. So how would we do that? Well, we would do that through preventative maintenance programs such as asphalt rejuvenators or microsurfacing. Those things would be preventative maintenance in nature, and they would be done when the PCI is up pretty high. If the PCI was allowed to drop down, we would go into a rehabilitation phase where resurfacing or hot mix in place would be applicable. And Chris will be talking about these different maintenance options in more detail in the coming presentation, but just to give you an idea. And then lastly, if we've allowed the pavement to deteriorate, we've got subsurface that needs to be reconstructed, we're talking about a significant amount of money. So that's the pavement maintenance options that we're looking at. Let's take a look at a minute what that does to a deterioration curve. This is a normal deterioration curve showing a number of years and the PCI rank, and it's kind of scrunched together here, so it's a little bit steeper, but you see that less slope at the beginning and then it breaks off. If we would apply certain pavement maintenance activities like resurfacing or doing a heavy patching along with the resurfacing, okay? So we're going in and we're doing heavy patching before we resurface. That's actually going to move that deterioration curve a little bit to the right, and it's going to flatten it a little bit because that heavy patching is going to keep it in the years out from deteriorating so much. The second curve here is shown with the asphalt rejuvenator. So now if we add asphalt rejuvenator, in those early years, it stays better longer. And so the curve gets moved out a little bit, and the top part of it is staying a little bit higher. And then the last part is the crack seal. And of course, the crack sealing helps prevent getting that moisture getting down into the pavement. And so applying these pavement maintenance activities throughout the life cycle, you create a new deterioration curve, and that deterioration curve represents an extension of the life cycle. So if we take that idea and apply it to a life cycle of pavement, it might look something like this, where the original pavement would deteriorate over time, and then we would have a resurfacing, and so on. And you see that as we go through that cycle, each time the subbase is deteriorated a little bit more. So the curve gets a little bit deeper. It's a little bit harder. That's why eventually we have to reconstruct. And that the cycles in which we have to come back and resurface are closer together. They're fewer in years, so the pavement surface itself doesn't stay up in the high level of service for a long time. And eventually we have to reconstruct. So if we look at this with the pavement maintenance in mind, we see the original pavement along with the resurfacing there. But now we're looking at a situation where our new deterioration curve is staying higher, up in the higher level of service longer, and it's not going as deep. And so, yes, eventually we'll have to reconstruct, but through the life cycle of that pavement, it's had a higher level of service for longer. And the base has not deteriorated as much over time. And so that's the argument for pavement maintenance. And from this example, we're saving about 20 to 25% over the life cycle of that pavement. So we've talked about measuring the pavement deterioration. We've talked about ways to extend the life cycle. Let's add costs now. And what we see is that the cost of maintenance increases as the pavement gets older, right? And there's a break point there, and that break point is when you have to resurface. And obviously there's another break point where you have to reconstruct. And when we look at the cost of these different maintenance activities over time and how they relate to the PCI, we see this change in the investment that's needed. So in the case where we're doing preventative maintenance, that asphalt rejuvenator, crack sealing, and microsurfacing, we're talking about $1 to $7 per square yard up in that high level of service. We get into the rehabilitation, we're talking about primarily resurfacing at much higher costs, and then of course the reconstruction or full depth reclamation, something like that, is even higher still. And so it's this difference and the increase in cost as PCI goes down, as the level of service is allowed to deteriorate, that is the rationale, is the economics behind doing the pavement maintenance. In the pavement management programs, it's important to first understand what your target is. And so here is an example of a community that developed what they wanted their pavement to look like. Now, their actual was not anywhere near this, and it was going to take several years to accomplish this, but this is where their end goal was, so that they had enough excellent and very good pavement to apply some of the pavement maintenance strategies, and not too many that were in the very poor or poor condition that they were needing to be reconstructed. But realizing that sometimes streets do get to that point where you need to reconstruct. So with this ideal distribution, they were able to then establish what their goal was, and then to do different permutations through the software to see how they could get to that goal. And some of those permutations are exemplified by this decision tree, where the user, you, the community, decides at what level you would do what strategy. And Chris will talk about this a little bit more, but for instance, if we were PCI of less than 85, we might look at a pavement maintenance activity. And if it was cracking was greater than 10, we might actually do that, including crack sealing. But if it was less than 10, we wouldn't do anything for that particular year. And so the algorithms in the software are going through these decision trees for every block, for every year, as you, the user, define the decision points, okay? And so then as a result, you get what the condition will be in the future. And then you can identify various goals and see how much it will cost to reach that goal. And that's what's shown here. So we have the pavement rank, that's the overall pavement rank for this community, versus the average annual street maintenance for a 5-year interval and a 10-year interval. So in this particular case, the community started with a current rank of 78, and they needed to spend about $7.5 million to maintain that rank of 78. They were currently spending 1.2, and that was down here. And so in 5 years, their rank was going to change from 78 to 70. You see that? So with a $1.2 million investment per year, they were going to be losing ground. And in order to kind of tread water where they are, stay where they are, they needed about 7.5. And so this is the kind of information that city councils and boards need to understand, that if they're not going to provide the funding, that the overall condition of the roadways is going to go down. In the end, it's all about putting that CIP program together, right? It's that 5 years program, and where are the streets that we're going to be resurfacing or maintaining over the next 5 and or 10 years. This is an example of one of the communities that we've worked with and their 5-year CIP for roads. And what you don't see here is that this is a result of both the software saying what was needed to be done and the interpretation of the engineer and the client in determining what program they wanted to implement, okay? So it's a combination. We don't just take what the computer says. We also look at that, particularly in terms of grouping streets together, because we know that when we have a number of streets that are located close together, we'll get a better unit cost. And so that's part of the strategy to stretch our roadway dollars. So in summary, the pavement condition allows us to be able to see how pavement deteriorates over time. We know that we can maintain, we can do some maintenance activities and extend that life cycle, and that we can do that in a timely basis that will actually save us money in the long run, optimizing and stretching our dollars that we're spending. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any recommendations for programs that are, easy to use and
So are you referring to software programs or? Yeah. So the question is, do we have any recommendations for software programs? And the answer is no. We have some that we are more familiar with than others, but over the last 5 years, there's been an upsurge in the number of vendors that are in the market. And so our recommendation is that you go through a proposal process, shortlisting, maybe doing a statement of qualification, then shortlisting 3 and getting their proposals. One thing to be careful about is the QA/QC. We have seen some communities in this area that have experienced less than high quality data. And the reason they know that is because they have a street that had a higher pavement condition index 3 years after it was done the first time. Now that was an anomaly, but that was enough for them to raise an eyebrow and to dig into the quality control behind that. And so the take home from that is that there is an important role in quality control in the implementation. But it's really through the RFQ, RFP process that you'll find what's the best program suited for your community. And it's a great learning experience to go through that as well. Yes, sir.
Like 2 or 3 slides back, you showed the example of like community. Yeah, this one here. How are you factoring in time to this calculation? Because all the graphs you showed is time is relative or qualitative measure.
Yes.
Assuming for this calculation, you need time to be a quantitative or measured part of this equation. How are you guys coming up with that?
So this is one point in time. It's 5 years out, right? So we were showing a number of the, I'm sorry. The question was, so the axis on here is money instead of time. Most of the graphs we were showing was time, and this one shows the dollar spent. So most of the graphs were showing how we deteriorate over time. What we've done here is taken one vertical slice, that's at one time, 5 years past the present, and then we've looked at the detail in terms of the cost. And so that's why we have two curves. We've done that at 2 points, at 5 years and at 10 years. And this is how it changes.
So if you're taking a 5-year window for this, are you taking two fixed points to say this road went from 78 to 70, or how are you?
Yes, yes. So it's from current to 5 years out. And look at that. How much did we spend to get here? And what's the overall PCI? And then 10 years. Very powerful. You can do all kinds of different permutations, and that decision tree can be modified. And Chris is going to talk a little bit more about how that works in terms of how it relates back to the preventative maintenance program. One more?
So what program was used for these graphs?
This particular program, we use Paver Pro, but we also use Paver, kind of the bare bones. I know there are several other interfaces that are really kind of user preference. So the data is pretty standardized now, but how it's displayed and the decision trees and all that stuff is software dependent. So there's a lot of different software there. Some are very engineering specific, some are more intuitive. And that's why I say it really depends, and why going through that selection process is really valuable, because you get to see, you know, what do the different screens look like? What do I have to do this? How many clicks do I have to do, and so on. So it's very valuable to go through that process. Yeah. Adam?
Do you convert data from Pacer to PCI or from PCI to Pacer?
I'm sorry, Adam, say it from PCI to
Convert data
Paver,
from Pacer management?
Pacer management? Yes,
PCI.
I believe you can. Chris, can you help me here? So Adam was asking about, can you convert the PCI to Paver?
Pacer to PCI. So
Paver to PCI.
Adam, you said Pacer, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So it would be probably a little bit difficult just because the Pacer is typically like driving like a windshield survey. You're not getting the detailed information that you're typically getting in the PCI. But you still get that 0 to 9 rating in the Pacer that you don't, and you could probably kind of calculate that into a PCI, but it's you're getting a lot more data with doing the PCI ranking.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, for that question. That kind of reminds me, the smartphone technology, the leader in that is a company called Robotics, and we've used them on a couple of surveys, and they don't really have a software that processes the data, but the data is relatively inexpensive. It's about $200 a mile, and they have various condition. And you know, we have our spreadsheet set up where we can essentially do those 5-year programs using canned deterioration curves. Anything else? Jeffrey.
Tim, my question is more for the group. How many communities here have a pavement management program that they use? Pretty good.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, 5 years ago, I don't think you would have seen that, right? So, good job. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, Brad. As Brad said, we're going to go over some roadway rehabilitation and maintenance options and how to utilize the pavement management software. And then Joe's going to go into some detail on the design engineering and the pavement maintenance related items. So first thing we're going to talk about is how to utilize the pavement management software. So you get a lot of data through the software. We're going to go through some stuff about how to implement that data and how to interpret it to come up with what your rehabilitation options might be. Go through how we determine what rehabilitation options to do, whether you're going to do pavement resurfacing versus pavement reconstruction. And then Joe will talk about the design engineering that will go into that based on which route you choose, and then we'll talk about the preventative maintenance as well. So first, just utilizing the pavement management software. So any roadway inventory data that you can have is going to go a long way to trying to help you interpret the data. So when was the original road constructed? When was the last year it was rehabilitated? Roadway functional class, is it a collector versus residential versus arterial? So why those are important is obviously original construction year, it's nice to know when the road was originally constructed and what has been done to the road throughout its life cycle. Is this the fourth or fifth time you're resurfacing it? Is it the first time? Has it been reconstructed in the past? The last rehabilitation year is important so that you can understand when it was last resurfaced or last rehabilitated, and then compare that to the PCI that you have to determine, if what you've been doing in the past is getting the lifespan that you would have expected. And then the roadway functional class. One thing you can do with these softwares is you can analyze your residential streets or just even one single subdivision by itself if you wanted to, or you could analyze only your collectors or your arterials, and you can have different decision trees for your collectors versus arterials versus residential. Obviously, typically you probably want to maintain a higher level of service and not let your PCI drop as far on your on your collector and arterial streets versus your residential. Other important information would be obviously roadway type. That's going to go to determine what sort of rehabilitation options you might have. Analyze your drainage conditions. Is it a rural pavement section versus a curb and gutter? That will change your cost per square yard that you would typically use in the software to determine your cost for each roadway. Any existing pavement data, traffic counts, existing pavement information, existing plans will kind of tell you what the existing pavement structure is. Is it adequate? Was it based on a older standard and you want to update it to a new standard? So all that kind of goes into determining what rehabilitation method you want to use. Once you kind of gather all that inventory data, you can use the program to analyze different things. So what the program can do will tell you how much of a certain distress you have in that specific area. And what is powerful about that is you can analyze what those types of distresses are and the severity, and that will give you a little bit of an idea of what potentially is going on with the pavement. And then you want to analyze your current PCI rank, look at the curve, and it'll age out your future PCI rank to see what it's going to be if you don't do anything to the street in 5 years or 10 years. You can analyze the subsurface conditions and base conditions, and then ultimately that software will provide you with a recommendation of what to do to each street. And then you can use your engineering judgment to determine if the software what it recommended is appropriate, or if you want to try and do something different based on the information that you have. As talked about, you want to review the existing pavement conditions and review the stresses. So the pavement softwares would typically take pictures of the roadways that they're surveying every 10 to 15 feet. So you can almost drive through the road, just flipping through the photos and look at the condition of the road. And that picture there is an example of a picture that was taken in the community that will show you what's going on that road. And what's important is to determine those types of distresses and what they mean. So, you know, transverse cracking versus alligator cracking, you know, that's a difference between whether or not you have an issue with your base potentially, or if it's just an issue in the surface. Same thing with the rutting versus the block cracking, and I will go into examples of what those look like. And then the severity is important because obviously a high severity is going to be a lot more important to fix than a low versus medium severity. So here's some examples of some pavement distresses. Obviously, potholes, I think we're all familiar with those with our amazing winters that we have. Alligator cracking there on the right, that's usually an indicator that you possibly have some base failure and moisture in the base that's causing that cracking to happen, as well as the rutting there in the bottom left. So that would be something that would be a red flag typically that you're going to have to do at the minimum, probably some sort of undercut or base patching there. You won't be able to just resurface over the top of that versus some of your more just surface cracking. You know, transverse and block cracking is typically because of your freeze thaw cycles where you just get cracking on the top layers and weathering just due to traffic and the winters that we have. So taking all of that information together, we kind of analyze all those things to determine what we want to do to each street. So taking the first step would be just coordinating, you know, reviewing the recommendation from the pavement management software. Does it make sense? Is it something that you want to do? You know, for instance, some communities, they don't want to reconstruct the cul-de-sacs because they get low traffic. So you might say, well, I don't want to, you know, even though that's what the software recommended, we're going to just do a resurfacing there. You want to do your data collection, get your existing data, try and gather any existing plans or any existing information on the roadway, get your geotechnical engineering done, pavement cores, for sure. So what's shown there obviously is some pavement cores, and what's important about that is that's going to tell you what your existing pavement section is. How thick is your existing asphalt? How thick is your sub-base stone below? That will tell you a lot of times whether or not the existing pavement section's adequate based on the traffic and the roadway functional class that you have. Another important thing about the cores when we get into some of the other things we're going to discuss is about the existing pavement interlayers such as Petromat or other fabrics, because some of the alternate strategies can't be done with those fabrics being done. And then obviously if you think you might have pavement reconstruction, you want to get soil borings to understand what the subgrade below the roadway is. You want to do your CCDD or clean construction demolition debris to make sure that you don't have any contaminated soil or any soil that needs to go anywhere. And then get your full report to be able to analyze what the existing subgrade and pavement conditions are. Then the fourth would be to determine your roadway rehabilitation options. So you want to make sure you're determining the correct and most efficient rehabilitation technique. You don't want to be over-designing, but don't want to under-design either based on all the information that we've talked about. And then utilize the pavement management software. So what's shown here is just from one program at the top is the paver program. So you can see on that section of pavement, there was some alligator cracking of medium severity and what the quantity was. It'll tell you you had some longitudinal and transverse cracking, and that will go a long way, as discussed, to determine what you want to do. And then the bottom picture there is an excerpt from the PavePro software, which will tell you the street that's highlighted there, Alice Avenue, there is a cracking score of 48 out of 100, so you got a lot of cracking, which has an overall surface score of 58, but your deflection score, which would be your base score, is 100. So that would tell you that your base is good there, but your surface needs to be resurfaced. So that would be just a candidate for a resurfacing project. So at this point, you're kind of faced with, do you want to do the pavement resurfacing or you want to do pavement reconstruction? So the first thing that we'll talk about is just pavement resurfacing options, things that go into it, and then a alternate cost-effective, when appropriate solution called hot-in-place recycling. And then we'll also talk about pavement reconstruction as well. So pavement resurfacing, I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with this, just your traditional resurfacing, standard mill and overlay with varying thicknesses. Obviously, the more you mill off and put back, the more expensive it is. Provides a new wearing surface. The costs can range anywhere from generally $18 to $36 a square yard, depending on various factors such as what your curb and gutter condition is, what the ADA requirements are, whether or not you want to include sidewalk repairs in with your program, what patching percentage you determine, and then generally the average cost is about $27 a square yard on most of our projects we've been working on. So the patching percentage, that's where, as Tim talked about, with that pavement management data, we'll be able to tell you if you think you have base problems or you might have base issues, you can do that heavy patching to try and fix that base, which is traditionally going to be cheaper to do it that way than just remove and replace all of the existing subgrade. So concrete repairs, each community is different and has their own standards, but at a minimum, typically you want to fix anything that's not draining, such as the picture there in the middle. That picture at the top, you'd probably want to fix that curb as well, because you're going to get a lot of moisture going through all those existing cracks, going down into your base. And then, everyone knows that you got to upgrade the ADA sidewalk ramps to the most up-to-date detail. Whether you want to add any trip hazards or any other sidewalk would be community dependent, but typically it's more cost-effective to do it while you have a contractor there than do it in a separate program, but that would be community specific. Patching repairs, I would say standard is usually throw on 3 to 5% just in case you run into some issues after you mill the surface. But if you think based on the pavement management software recommendations and information that you might have additional base repair, then you might want to throw a heavier amount of patching at your 10 to 15%. The thickness will vary whether you want to get all the way down to the base, if you want to go into the base and do base removal as part of your patching, and then, or if you want to do undercuts and then patch it back, those are all options as well. Sometimes it is more cost effective to just mill all the way down to the existing stone and proof roll, do any undercuts, and resurface the road. So this would be one where maybe it was an existing road that was built that was only 2 or 3 inches of asphalt on 12 or 13 inches of stone, and you want to get 4 or 5 inches. Well, maybe you mill off the whole section, mill off some of the stone. You would proof roll, do any base repairs that's needed, and then go over the top based on whatever thickness you want to put back. A lot of times that's a lot more cost effective than doing an entire reconstruction and ripping out all of the existing stone and pavement section. So those are all kind of different resurfacing considerations that would go into your traditional resurfacing options. An alternative would be to do hot-in-place recycling. So what the hot-in-place recycling is it's a train of equipment that goes through and heats the asphalt back up to 300-400 degrees into a working condition. It takes a scarifying unit that goes through and scarifies off about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches deep. It'll go back through a screed, and then it'll get paved back down, and then you would put a new layer on top of that. So For curb and gutter areas, obviously you need to mill off whatever thickness of your wearing surface you want to put on. So if you want to put 2 inches of surface, you'd have to mill 2 inches of surface first, then come in and do the hot in place recycling. There is a high mobilization cost, so you would want to do a fairly large section of roadway to do this. You wouldn't want to just do 1 or 2 blocks. It can be, you know, there's a long equipment train. It's usually about 40 feet with the unit that heats the asphalt back up, the scarifying unit, and then there's a unit that adds in an asphalt rejuvenator back in and pays it back down. So with that, it's a little bit difficult to get around really sharp curves, and obviously you can't do it in cul-de-sacs, has a hard time getting around some radiuses, and then it cannot be used, this is where, as mentioned before, cannot be used on areas that have pavement fabric because the scarifying unit won't be able to tear up the fabric. So what's shown here, as discussed, is the scarifying unit. So there's little like tines that go through and scarify the asphalt up to about 1.5 inches, and then that's where they introduce the asphalt rejuvenator, and then you just use a standard paving screed to put the recycled material back down to your standard compaction methods, and then you would overlay with a new asphalt surface. And typically this can save you because you're not replacing that 1.5 inches of existing asphalt, you're just reusing what's there. Can save you a little bit, so the typical costs with your overlay and your concrete improvements can be anywhere from $14 to $20 a square yard. So based on the information that was discussed earlier, if we determine that the pavement reconstruction is the correct route to go down, then you know, you'll have to completely grind off the existing pavement, and then you'll typically got to remove and replace the existing base course, proof roll the subgrade, and maybe make repairs to the subgrade. Obviously, this is typically a very timely project. It takes a long time for the contractor to remove all the material, get it all graded out, has a great impact and effect on the residents. It's extremely expensive because you have to haul off all the material to either a CCDD facility, or if you're unlucky and have contaminated soil, to a non-special waste facility. And then obviously it typically involves road closures, possibly detours, and typically doesn't make people very happy. But sometimes that's what's needed and recommended in order to get the lifespan you want out of the roadway. Sometimes you obviously make some adjustments to the existing profile to be able to get the road to drain properly. Sometimes it involves utility improvements such as water main or storm sewer replacement, or sanitary sewer improvements. And then your typical costs can be range anywhere from $75 to $140 a square yard just for the road portion of it. That would not include any utility improvements in that as well. So what we're going to talk about is an alternative to that when it makes sense, which would be to do full depth reclamation with either cement or lime stabilization. So in this option, you are again completely removing down to whatever depth of asphalt you want. So if you want 6 inches of new asphalt, you remove 6 inches of existing pavement, could be existing an existing base. And then you would utilize the existing base material and implement in a additive to strengthen your base into a new base, basically, and then you would pave over the top of this. It does require you to do a detailed mix design to determine how much of the additive that you need to add. And then, so yeah, the pulverization mixes the material and creates a new homogeneous base material with an additive, as discussed, such as cement, lime, or asphalt. So what's shown in the top left there, that's the reclamating machine. It's the machine that comes in and churns up the road. You can typically do anywhere from, I want to say, 8 to 16 inches deep of reclamation, and then it would put down the new base, which is shown there in the bottom left, and what's shown in the bottom right there is what the existing roadway looked like. This particular project that we utilized it in was an area where the community had existing pozzolanic base and had a lot of issues with freeze-thaw, and we were able to use this full depth reclamation to remediate that and put it back down
and it saved, obviously it was a little bit more cost effective, but they were also able to get it done a lot quicker. So they were able to do the full depth reclamation that we did for this project in 2 days, as opposed to probably 2 or 3 weeks worth of doing the traditional reconstruct. Couple things to note would just be it's economical when applicable, but there is high mobilization costs. So again, you want to make sure that you're doing a large section. In this particular project, we did I think like 1.5 miles of improvements. You don't want to just be doing a couple blocks. Good candidates are roads that exhibit base failure but have good drainage. So it's important to make sure that you have well-draining base, and if you don't, then you might have to use lime instead of cement to stabilize that, or you could potentially have to add in under drains to make sure that you're getting your base to drain properly. If you don't get your base to drain, you can have freeze thaw issues with heaving in the future. And then it can, as discussed, will greatly decrease the number of times residents will be affected versus the traditional reconstruction. So it's able to be done under traffic, and once they're done doing the reclamation and the cement, the residents are able to drive on it the same day while the cement's curing. It must be overlaid with a binder and surface course, and then it is much more cheaper and environmentally friendly than conventional reconstruction. So what's shown here in the pictures would be after the reclamating machine comes through and reclamates up all the existing material, there's a cement truck. In this project, we use cement truck that comes in and puts the cement back down. And then there's a water truck that will hook up to the reclamator, introduce the water, and mix the material back up. And then what's in that bottom right would just be your traditional road grader grading out the new base. They'll roll and compact it, and then let it cure. One thing that you want to do with the full depth reclamation with cement is to check for whether or not you need to do micro cracking. So if the full depth reclamation gets too strong, basically, you come in and basically take a roller to micro crack the top, and that will prevent you from having your base kind of act as concrete, and will give it more flexibility so you don't have as much of the heaving issues. It typically costs from $40 to $65 a square yard, depending on how much of a overlay that you add, and how much concrete improvements that you perform. And then the last kind of reconstruction that we did in a community in the village Montgomery, they had existing alleys, downtown alleys that the village is required to maintain, that they that people have their driveways off of, so they just get residential traffic. And they had they did not have a lot of good areas to be able to drain the water. There's a couple dips in the middle of them, and so the village came up, and we came up with the solution to put in porous hot mix asphalt. So what happens is the water will go through the asphalt into the base below, and then we did a permittivity test of the existing soil to determine that it was able to, permeate back through the soil, because they had a lot of sand and gravel in that area. But we did still install under drains just as a extra measure to make sure that that base does get drained. And you can see the difference in the pictures there. So the one on the bottom left was probably the alley that was in the worst condition and had a big belly in the middle of it with no outlet for the water. And then that picture on the right is, after a rainstorm, what it looked like. So it's been a good success to help those alleys drain and also get them a new wearing surface. Obviously, you want to make sure, because of that, the structure of the existing asphalt is obviously very porous. It's not good candidates for areas with high turning movements and high truck traffic. So in this case, it's just very few turning movements required, and it was just in a residential area with residential cars. So now Joe is going to talk about some of the design engineering. I guess, does anyone have any questions before I pass it off to Joe?
I was wondering for the base ratings, like what type of testing that you suggest for that with the pavement management program?
Okay, so the question was, what type of testing do we recommend for the base conditions? So typically what they'll do is what's called a falling deflectometer test. Well, they'll apply a load, and then typically it's done once every block. And what they'll do is they'll have 4 or 5 sensors that will pick up how that load is deflecting the pavement, but also the base and the subgrade below. So that would be that would be what was typically recommended when you do the base testing.
Is pavement age a factor in the hot in place recycling?
The question was, is pavement age a factor in the hot in place recycling? I would say pavement age and condition would be important. So obviously the older the pavement, generally the more rejuvenator you're going to have to add in because you've oxidized and lost a lot more asphalt than if it was newer. The other thing is typically the way that I would think about it is with the way that it looks like below is kind of what it's going to look like when you put it back in. You're not generally adding any extra material or anything, so you want to make sure that it's got, you know, it doesn't have base failure or any of those issues if you were going to use that option.
For the reclamation, is the base design or existing condition, how much does it impact the applications? From the photos, it looks like you had a compacted soil sort of base with maybe a couple inches of stone or something.
I guess could you clarify a little bit more?
So,
I can go back to the pictures.
yeah, I was just trying to determine, right, so it doesn't look like there's a lot of undercuts or additional excavation in these photos for this reclamation process. So I'm trying to determine, is that soil that's existing and being compacted? Is that soil that's been brought in or what?
That's existing aggregate base course. In this case, was existing aggregate base course and pozzolanic base that got ground up and then put back down, and the cement and water got all mixed together to make a new material.
I see.
So that's what that picture that's getting graded is showing. Is that's what it looks like.
That's the.
That's the new base that's being used.
I see, okay. That makes sense.
All right, I will pass it off to Joe.
Thanks, Chris. Design engineering considerations. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how we develop the design for road and street programs, resurfacing programs. There's some items here that I want to speak about. Field inspection. So one of the first tasks that we do, our designer or maybe two get their vests on and head out to the field. We go and check for, you know, conditions of the pavement, areas where there might be potential patching that's needed. We also look for areas of curb and gutter removal and replacement, and also sidewalk removal and replacement. You know, on sidewalks, we're looking for trip hazards. A lot of municipalities have their own criteria for, you know, how much they're willing to replace, you know, what condition, how many cracks in the curb there are. Then there's also ADA compliance. I'll be speaking a little bit more about that. Utility coordination, always important in any project, no matter the size. Making sure that the utilities know that there's a project happening, making sure that there's you know, no conflicts. You know, some of the cable companies do put their cables pretty shallow, so it does happen that we run into issues on, you know, removal and ADA improvements. And then pavement permit coordination. A lot of, you know, sometimes your projects are going to extend into IDOT and county right away. In those cases, you're going to be required to get a permit. There's also times where you have to replace detector loops. You know, IDOT uses detector loops for all their traffic signals. So anytime you're going to be impacting those detector loops, you're going to have to get a permit through IDOT. Other items are CCDD. you know, IEPA coordination for the removal of any soils. And then we'll go about the, you know, the roadway design. You know, is it full depth reclamation? Is it you know, mill and resurface? Determining, you know, typical sections. You know, sometimes on some projects, our clients want to change the radius return of an intersection. You know, those items will all be taken care of in the design, roadway design. And then there's other considerations. Some of those are, you know, drainage. We go out there, we try to go out on the field after it rains to see how the roadway is draining. Is there a need for additional inlets? Sometimes we even have had lengths of storm sewer to make the pavement drainage better. And then when we're out in the field, we also check the structures. Are there any that need to be reconstructed? What's the condition of some of the structures along the roadways that we're resurfacing? So project plans. Not all projects are required to have plans. Maintenance section, you know, MFT projects are not required to have plans. But we, if they're required, we would provide plans. Typically, there's always specifications. If there's not plans required, there's always specifications. And then the cost estimates. Well, one of the most important parts of these projects is the cost estimate, making sure that you have enough material in there so that it reduces the amount of change orders in the field or extras that come about. We also like to put in a little bit of fluff, especially on asphalt for, you know, loss of material. Also, you know, changes, sometimes add a, you know, couple of sidewalk squares, make sure, because once, you know, when you're doing the ADA stuff, sometimes you end up having to replace more squares than you thought you would. And then QCQA, the cornerstone of good quality work, is a necessity on every project. So we would do hopefully someone that hasn't been, you know, a fresh set of eyes is the best person to QA a project. They can catch things that the normal designer would, you know, had been looking at it for months, won't catch. Oops. My fault there. There we go. ADA compliance. So up there's an example of a sheet that our field guys take out to the field. They use their smart level. They go and start measuring the slope of the squares, and we fill out these corner sheets, come up with the best design for replacing those ADA ramps. Sometimes full topographic survey is necessary because the area is, you know, steep or whatnot, and sometimes you'll have to put up curbs in order to make the ADA work, and you know, sometimes you'll have to replace several squares back from the corners. So we do all that in design. The project plans and specifications, you know, Rebuild Illinois funds, bond funds, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Those any projects that are utilizing those funds need to have plans and specifications. Also, any projects that are considered by IDOT to be a construction section and not in a maintenance section would require plans. But if you're just using MFT funds on a maintenance section, you would just need a bid package and specs. Typically in those specs, we would put exhibits showing, you know, typical section exhibits showing what the work is going to be done. We'll have exhibits showing where the ADA ramps are that are to be replaced, but they wouldn't be a detailed set of plans. So resurfacing considerations. If you're going to be resurfacing, obviously the overlay thickness, Chris had brought it up. You know, are you milling off 3, putting back 3? Are you milling down to the stone? You know, what asphalt mix are you going to be using? Do you have your own municipal mix? Some do. You know, what type of aggregate, you know, and bitumen are you going to use? do you have a unique mix design that you want to use on specific streets. But if you are going to be using MFT funding, you will be required to use the IDOT mixes, which is shown in the table there. The mix table, it's based on ADT, and you would be required to use those mixes. Longitudinal joint sealant, it's something that's newer, but most projects, it's actually an IDOT standard now. It increases the density between paving passes, so wherever your paving joint is gonna be, you put that down on the binder before you pave surface. And it helps to prevent water from seeping down, because that first crack down the middle is usually the first crack you see. And that will help, it increases the density of the pavement there and prevents the water from getting down deeper into the binder and then eventually into your base. So a lot of projects are using this these days. We use it quite a bit. IDOT's using it now. It's definitely a good method to keep those joints dry. Then we got the reflective crack treatment. Between the layer between the surface and the binder, you can put a polyamide type binder that will, or a fabric type material in between that layer that acts sort of similar to the longitudinal joint sealant. It prevents, it helps keep the cracks from protruding below into the binder course of the pavement. Preventive maintenance. I'm going to talk a little bit about some preventive maintenance items. Here I got some figures here that show kind of what the pavement looks like in cross-section view for each type. This one would be a very good pavement from 4 to 7 years. As you can see, the center line crack is barely visible at the surface. And then here is a good pavement from 8 to 10 years. The center line crack is now well into the pavement structure. You're starting to see other cracks develop on the outsides and in the middle. And then here is a poor 15 plus years pavement. Your center line crack has made it all the way down to the base, which is not good because water is reaching there now. And you have a lot of other cracking that's happening across the pavement section. So here's some items that both Tim and Chris talked about, ways to intercept that curve and extend the life of the pavement. Asphalt rejuvenator, it's an application of a thin layer of emulsion that's placed down. After they place that layer of emulsion, they typically spread sand across the road, and the sand is for traction purposes mostly, because it gets pretty slippery when you put the emulsion on. This is typically applied like 1 to 2 years after resurfacing, so it's something high up when your PCI is still pretty high. It's a way to extend the life and change that curve, as Tim had talked about. It takes about 15 to 45 minutes, and when they spread it, you'll see it on the surface, and when it's gone, you'll actually see that it's gone, and then they spread the sand on there. And this typically extends the life of the pavement from 3 to 5 years, and it typically costs $1 to $1.20 a square yard. Crack sealing, everybody's I think familiar with this one. It's utilized pretty much everywhere. It prevents water from penetrating the base. You're going to want to seal the cracks as you see them. A lot of municipalities will have a crack sealing program to go out and crack seal as soon as, after the winter, find cracks, seal them right away. It can't hurt. You're going to prevent that water from getting to the base, and that's what you want. You want to try to stop that as soon as possible. And, typically, you do them as you see them, and the previous graphs is like year 4 is when you start to see the cracking, and that's, 4 to 6 is when you're going to start seeing more cracking, so you're going to want to get out there and seal them. And that's typically 45 to 60 cents per foot. Microsurfacing, it's another preventative maintenance option. It's typically done around the 8 to 12 year mark. You're gonna want a crack seal and do any patching prior to doing this microsurfacing. It's an application of a thin layer of emulsion. And, it's ideal for roadways that have higher volumes of traffic without difficult application areas. So areas where the road is real curvy, there is a little bit of a equipment train here, so it does have difficulty getting to those tight corners, even though you can still do it by hand. It's important to know that if you do it by hand, the surface, it doesn't come out the same as if it's placed mechanically, so there will be a little difference in color and whatnot. It's also important to do a little public outreach on this because of this, mostly because of the sand, just so people realize why the sand is there. It will be vacuumed up the day after, but people will drive over it, so it's important to have a little public outreach. It typically costs between $4.50 and $7 per square yard. So here's a kind of a, back to Tim's curve, here's a typical deterioration curve, showing it PCI versus age. And then here's what the new deterioration curve could be if you do preventative maintenance. You could see the curve at the top is flatter. It keeps the pavement PCI higher, and you extend the life of it. So in conclusion, utilizing the pavement management software, it's the start of your CIP program, determining the proper rehabilitation methods. Are you going to resurface? Are you going to microsurface? Are you just going to mill off 2 and put back 2? Your design is important. It can give you good unit prices, the timing of when you bid the project, making sure all your items are there. It'll prevent, overages in the field. You'll be well aware. You'll be able to budget well with a good design. And then obviously the pavement maintenance can optimize the life of your pavement, and it could intercept that deterioration curve and extend the life of your pavement. Is there any questions?
What are your thoughts on grouting as part of the crack fill project? Is it recommended, or you just crack fill without doing the grouting, fracking things?
So the question was how I felt about routing. I personally think that, and I'll let Chris chime in too, is that it would depend on the width of the cracks. If they're wider, you really don't need to route it, in our opinion. But if you are gonna if they're gonna be narrow cracks, I think then routing would make sense because you're not gonna get it down in there enough. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, I would agree. Generally, I would recommend doing the routing, because what I found is if you don't do the routing on the smaller cracks, is that the crack seal will just come up the next year after the snow plows come in. So yeah, generally, we would recommend doing routing and then doing the crack filling. The larger cracks, like Joe said, they're big enough that you probably don't have to do it, but the routing's so cheap, it's usually not that big of a deal.
What's your opinion on the LJS milling? Like after you place it, then the next time when you come through and mill, does it come from the machines or does it get ground up well?
I haven't heard any issues with that. I think it's not like a fabric, so it grinds up well, is from what I've heard. And I'm pretty sure IDOT would
Yeah, so when you put it down, it goes down like the way that it's shown, but when you put it back, you put the asphalt on top, it actually heats it up and turns it back into a liquid. So you don't actually have like a fabric or anything that's there, so it would just get ground like a normal road.
Okay,
What about fiber versus rubber crack filling?
Fiber versus rubber.
Typically, they would recommend doing the fiber modified crack sealing when you do the microsurfacing, but you can do, the rubber, I think it works fine with the roadway. But the fiber probably is better, but it's also more expensive.
Are you aware of any recent studies or data showing how effective the rejuvenators are? We've used them in the past, but have a hard time justifying them to the higher ups as the results that are not obvious.
I personally have not seen any studies, and I did look a little bit before today. I have not seen any studies on that yet. We do have a couple municipalities we use that do it. I know we use it on bike paths too. You know, right after the year after a bike path is paved, a shared use path. But I have not seen any studies on that.
Was that a Riviera project? Is that something that you can use MIT for yet? Or something that would prove that material?
No. I believe microsurfacing too is not, or is that, it is, oh, they just recently approved that, right?
You use the LJS on surface roads, or is that for divine only? Should that be applied over
Like
Yes.
on the built surface?
I would think so.
I've not done it that way. I've usually just done it between like the binder and the surface, but, I'm sure you probably could. But I don't have experience with that.
What I've been trying to do with the LJS is see if anybody's been using it against the curb line so that it can, when the capillary reaction can draw it up and kind of seal that instead of rubberized crack fill and routing along the curb line. Nobody seems to know anything, but you've definitely done it.
Well, a lot of our municipalities actually route along the curb and crack fill.
So
Yeah.
I was curious if you can kind of incorporate that into the paving process where you don't get to come back, people are calling angry, you just did this road a year ago, why are you routing things, why are you doing things? So if you can somehow incorporate that into the paving, where then that you could maybe place the LJS along the curb line and draw it up that way.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. I have had projects where we've used it because we've had more than just the joint at the crown. We've used it at other joints across the section, but I haven't yet to do that. That's an interesting idea, though.
Have you come up with any alternatives for curb repairs other than remove and replace? We spend a lot of money doing curb repairs. There's something for minor breaks that might be more cost effective than full removal. I've heard of using shotcrete, but I've also been told that that's equally as expensive as remove and replace.
Yeah, most of our municipalities that we work for have been removing and replacing. I mean, we grind the curbs sometimes, right?
I would say it depends. I mean, if it's a drainage issue, obviously it's got to be removed or replaced. But I think one way, you know, whatever, depending on your community standard, is instead of removing or replacing like some of the cracked curb, maybe you just epoxy, you know, you saw cut and seal that crack as opposed to replacing the whole section. But in terms of like spalling and stuff, you could do like an Ardex or an epoxy material. But I would have some concern about just the longevity of that, especially with the snowplows and everything going by.
We've used the LJS in industrial areas or commercial areas, so less driveways, more straight throughs with a concrete base.
but not in the residential areas. Our concern is among the driveways, the backing in and turning out. Has anybody had any issues in a residential area with it picking up or?
None at all. In like 15 minutes it breaks and it's fine.
Okay, thanks.
So the question is there any issues in residential areas? We haven't run into any issues with it coming out.
The backing in and out, you know, versus just a straight linear.
Yeah, no, I haven't run into any issues on that.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for being here today. So, as Brad mentioned, my portion today is on effective design, implementation, and construction management. So you've spent all the time and money to evaluate your roads, prepare your pavement management plan, budget your work, but it's important that you have a plan to effectively implement the design and then actively manage the construction. So I know there's a lot of construction experience in the room here, but I just want to discuss a few keys to keep in mind to get the most out of your roadway projects. So as Brad mentioned, I've been at EEI for 14 years, mostly in the field, so before I get into it, I know everybody can appreciate all the fun things that happen on roadway construction projects, so I just wanted to give a shout out to a few of my favorites that we've seen over the years. You know, it seems like every year they never cease to amaze you how, no matter how many signs you have up, no matter how many cones you have up, somebody does something ridiculous. You know, you got the classic bike through wet cement, footprint in wet cement. We started putting up cones to try to keep people from driving into their driveways with the after prime, and you can see they kind of just disregard. And then my favorite though is that one down there on the left. We were reconstructing a road, had all the signs, they managed to get around all the barricades, and that's B618 depressed curb, so that's a 24-inch wide, 9-inch tall ribbon of concrete that tiny car managed to get all the way on top of. So I just thought you guys would all appreciate that. I'm sure you have your own stories, so I just wanted to touch on that before we get into it. Getting it off was the impressive part. So today's agenda, I'm going to try to hit a few key points along the entire process of the project, from pre-bid into pre-construction, and then a few aspects of construction, including flexibility, public outreach, having a plan, and then material testing and QA. So we're talking a lot about stretching your dollars. So, you know, what does that mean? Stretching your roadway dollars means no dollar goes to waste. You know, as Brad mentioned, the cost of materials is rising, 12.6% minimum. We see it every day. Costs are constantly going up. So it's essential that the dollars that we are spending are being used effectively and in a deliberate manner. Making every dollar counts, achieved through effectively implementing the design and then actively managing the construction activity. And I like to think of myself when I'm out on a job kind of like Moneyball. You know, they set up the perfect design project, and I'm there to manage it to success. And this starts before construction even begins. So touching on a few pre-bid items, I like to have solid specs. You know, what does that mean? It eliminates contractor arguments, limits resident complaints, and then we tend to learn from past programs. So what did we argue about with the contractor last year? And then implement that in the spec for the following year. A few examples of these, when ADA sidewalk lowering or sidewalk reconstruction became part of all the design projects. You know, when you have to lower the sidewalk maybe a foot to make it compliant, where does that material go? Contractor might argue, hey, that's extra excavation. So including things like that in your spec limits arguments. We've started implementing timelines and penalties, so not just completion dates, but maybe midline completion dates on certain neighborhoods, or if there's schools along the way. Adding those kinds of things to your specs can help limit resident complaints. And then housekeeping standards, so making sure they don't have open holes on open curbs or open sidewalk for extended periods of time. I know that's fairly commonplace, but adding those into your specs and really holding the contractor accountable is important. And it helps move the job along as well. Also building in flexibility. So as Joe said, we like to add fluff. I'm not a huge fan of that term. I like it to be purposeful, so things that we see year to year that constantly get overrun. You know, restoration is one, that's a big one. You think you replace 30 feet of curb, you're gonna have 2 feet behind the curb that's gonna be replaced for restoration. Well, if you had to raise that curb up 6 inches, now you might need to go 6 feet or 10 feet beyond the curb for restoration, things that aren't obvious when you're designing sometimes. So adding fluff quantities for restoration, or seems like without fail when you're out there, you got 30 foot of curb marked out, you remove it, you go to replace it, you needed 5 more feet to get it to flow. You know, so having extra quantities for things like that goes a long way. And then same with ADA corners, you know, having extra sidewalk accounted for to make sure that things are compliant in the field. Everything looks good on paper, you want to make sure that it'll work in the field. And then pre-bid, you want to have an effective bidding strategy. So you want to be bidding early. The earlier the better. You know, February is better than May. You know, March is better than July, things like that. You know, you don't want to get out too early. You want to make sure that the kind of price increases have set in, or maybe decreases if we ever get lucky again. But you want the prices to be established for the following year. Get out to bid, you're going to get better prices. And then another bidding strategy, as Joe mentioned, that not all of our contracts require plans. So in the absence of plans, the more info you can include, the less ambiguity, the better pricing you're going to get. So some things, detailed information to consider, is the curb or sidewalk that you're going to replace accessible from the road? You know, like it's often overlooked. It's easy to just mark out sidewalk or curb on the plans to be replaced, but if the contractor can't reach it, they don't know that they have to bring out maybe a buggy to get the concrete there, or they don't know they have to have some sort of special truck to get the concrete there. That's going to be an argument. So you want to have as much information as possible, accurate information. That's going to get better pricing and less arguments from the contractor. And we found that contractors remember these challenges, so if you're constantly putting in things in your plans where contractor can't reach it, or it's a nightmare to do, they're going to remember those things, and you're going to see prices kind of bump up over the years. So the more information you can add, the better off you're going to be. And so now you've bid the project out, and you're kind of in the pre-construction phase, okay? So you want to, ideally you're able to inspect the roadways before the design. That's not always possible. Sometimes you're adding roads late, they're covered by snow, they're covered by leaves. So it's really important for the RE to perform a field review prior to construction. So they're gonna go lay out all the removal limits accordingly. This is, again, when you don't have plans, this is especially important. And then oftentimes this is when residents give their input. A lot of times residents might not say anything, and then they start seeing arrows on the ground, mark out some sidewalk in front of their house. They're gonna have questions. They're gonna tell you where are the spots where it freezes in the winter that you might not know about, or where all the kids like to stand for the school bus that might need some sidewalk addressed. And then this is also your chance too to address anything that may have happened since the design was put in place. Over the winter you get snowplow damage, heaving due to freeze-thaw, all sorts of things, utility repairs, things like that. So this is your time for the RE to really inspect everything and address everything. And then it's really important for your RE during layout to measure the quantities as they go. You know, we like to make this a priority. That way you know from the start that you're starting on budget. You know, if you lay out all the quantities and all of a sudden you're way over one of your quantities, you're in a bad way right away, so it's important to be able to adjust. And then we like to make sure too that the quantities make sense in the field. So doing things like laying out 30 feet of curb with a 5-foot piece that you're keeping, and then another 30 feet of curb you're going to replace doesn't always make sense. Easier just to have one 65-foot long piece. You can get the drainage to work better that way. You're not trying to match in for these little pieces. And then sort of on the flip side, you know, not doing all these repairs with 2-3 foot pieces of curb, making it 5-10 foot minimums. And then in pre-construction too, it's important for the RE to understand the scope and the intent. So with curb, are we fixing all the cracks as they mentioned before, or are you just fixing drainage issues? Are you just fixing all the sidewalk cracks or just trip hazards? Do you do partial driveway repairs or full driveway repairs? Having this scope in mind with the RE before they go out there to start market removal limits is important. If they think that if you're only replacing halves, you don't want to start replacing full driveways if you don't have to. I like to set a criteria and stay consistent. We often recommend written policies. That's helped us in the past. So if you have a written policy on which driveways get replaced or which curb gets replaced, it goes a really, really long way with the residents. When you say, hey, the policy is drainage issues and major failures. If you have a written policy that you can show a resident, oftentimes that limits the complaints from the resident. Then they know it's being applied consistently, and that it's not like, why is Joe's driveway getting replaced and mine's not? You can clearly point to something to back yourself up. So after you've gone through your pre-bid items, your pre-construction items, you followed all the design best practices and you've created the perfect design project, and now your field work's about to start, and we all know everything goes perfectly in the field, right? And there's an example of a perfect field project right there. That car was 500 feet down a road that was removed because Google told them to go that way. And it took 2 tow trucks to get it out. So I'm sure you guys can all appreciate that. All right, so once you're in the field, a few things to keep in mind. Flexibility is key. Having the ability to add and subtract during construction is important based on your field observations. Being able to react in real time. So having all of your measurements completed prior to construction allows for quick reactions, and it eliminates downtime. So if you know right where your project is at all times, you can make quick reactions based on changing field conditions. Something that we try to do is have sort of our borderline areas in our back pocket. So if you know that all of a sudden something changes and you can keep maybe a piece of curb or some sidewalk you were expecting to get rid of, you'd have a borderline area in mind that you can right away mark out and get replaced. Or the flip side, if you're starting to go over those borderline areas that would be nice to replace but maybe aren't vital, you can start scaling back in those areas. Something else to be flexible in the field is we tend to try to do a mill and evaluate strategy. Even if the pavement management plan says reconstruct or milling and resurfacing with heavy patching, some areas may have poor PCI or look like they need a lot of patching, but it's important to mill and then evaluate. So mill the area first, utilize proof rolls or your geotech sub if necessary, but there's no sense in doing work that doesn't need to be done. So this is especially important in patching. You want to make sure to replace any required deficiencies, even if it's only small areas, but don't feel the need to use all the quantity. So I've seen REs before where you have 1,000 square yards of patching on the job and they feel like they have to go mark out 1,000 square yards of patching. That's wasting your money. So only get what's necessary and don't feel the need to just use all of your quantity. So identifying patching needs prior to milling is an inexact science. Some roads look terrible before you mill it and look great afterwards. So just being prepared to adjust based on field conditions will produce the best end product and eliminate unnecessary spending. So similar to consistency during design, staying consistent with the scope and intent during construction is important. Oftentimes it's hard to know when to stop. So having a consistent scope is important. Remaining consistent with your pre-established criteria. If the scope of the project is street repair, we're focusing on roadway dollars. We try to only get essential ancillary items. Some villages do replace everything, which is, if you've got the money to do that, that's fine. But if you're focusing on stretching roadway dollars to improve your overall road system, only repairing essential sidewalk and then not deviating. If that's the plan, don't deviate. It's easy to kind of get in the mode of marking out every little crack and every little bump along the way, but you really want to get your major areas and not deviate while you're laying things out, and keep the focus on the roadway. And then something else with consistency is building a good reputation. This does not mean being a pushover by any stretch. You know, you have a symbiotic relationship. You want to hold the contractor accountable, but we often try to avoid adding restrictions after the fact. You know, if you don't allow steel forms, make sure you have that in the spec. Don't let them show up with steel forms and then tell them, hey, you can't use steel forms. Or avoid large deviations from planned work. You know, contractors tend to hate that. One, you're going to get a huge price if you're deviating, if you're trying to do extras. We all know how that goes. They can blow up in an instant. And we've seen with some of our programs, for instance in Schaumburg, where we're being consistent every year, you see those prices kind of go down or stay low every year. You're not seeing huge increases because they know they're going to show up. They're going to have a consistently run program with good design and good working relationships. An often overlooked part of construction is public outreach. You know, it's easy to forget, but the reason that we're doing all these projects is to better the community for the residents. And so taking care of as many problems as efficiently as possible is a good way to stretch your money, and you can do this with public outreach. Keeping the residents involved and informed allows the most efficient construction. The more proactive we can be, the greater chance the residents are going to be aware of what's happening, the greater response times we can get to their calls and their questions, the happier they're going to be. Why is this important? Well, it minimizes mobilizations by the contractor and subs. You know, there's nothing worse than you get through an entire street, then a resident calls, my driveway needs to be fixed. You kind of evaluate it, yeah, it does. Now you have to do another mobilization for a concrete pour. Or you go to pave a street and there's a car parked on it. So having resident involvement in public outreach minimizes slowdowns, gets rid of those parking issues, gets rid of residents driving on prime. And, you know, without fail, every time I show up on a street to do some sort of road work, there's a guy moving or there's a guy having a party, and you plan to mill, and now there's 40 cars parked on the street for a birthday party. You know, it seems to happen every year, and the more public outreach you can have, the less likely that's going to happen. And, you know, the big plus to this is that you have less time investment by village staff. So if we're being proactive, if we're reaching out to residents, they're not calling complaining, village staff isn't being brought in to deal with these problems, you guys can have your time free to go do other things where your time's being time is more valuable. And also it gives a greater sense of satisfaction by the residents. So there's nothing better than doing a good job on a project. A person is happy with how it goes. They know their tax dollars are being spent wisely and they're not wasted. And what this does is you get a greater buy-in for future projects. So when you want to, you know, raise taxes or do extra work or what have you, having other residents say, you know, they do a great job out there. They really spend our money wisely. They're giving us a great product. It was very smooth. You get that greater buy-in for future construction. But no matter how well a project is planned, unexpected changes do occur. You know, it's construction after all. So what do we do when things do not go as expected? You know, it's important to have a plan and be prepared to pivot. So we like to do constant budget tracking. This gives a snapshot of the project budget on a daily basis and allows for real-time decision making. Is the project trending over or under? And does this allow for adjustments to be made not only on our program, but elsewhere in the village or in the municipality? So if you come to me and you have a water main job going on, you say, how's our budget looking on this road program? And I say, man, we got $30,000 that we're saving right now, projected to be under. You know, that water main job they've got going on, if it's going a little bit over, you might breathe a little easier, not have to shift things around as much, have some extra money in your pocket. So it just allows for adjustments all over the municipality. And this is when it's important also to know your pavement management plan and then have plans in place. So if you are running over budget, which street are you going to cut first, or are you going to be able to do you have more room in your budget? So knowing that ahead of time is very important because ideally it's not needed. You know, you have a perfectly designed program, but crazy things happened, and being prepared is your best idea. On the flip side of that, you know, which streets can you add to a project if you have budget surpluses? So I understand with MFTs, this isn't always an option. You can't just add streets on an MFT job. But if you have locally funded projects, being prepared to add is important. We seem to do it often on a lot of projects. If you think about it, if you have a $3.5 million program and it comes 5% under, that's $175,000. So you can put it in your pocket, you can roll it over to the next program, but typically nothing is as cheap as it is that year. Everything's always going to go up. So if you can take that $175,000, apply it to another street, you're going to make your money go further. But having them in mind prior to construction avoids us trying to do a last-minute design in the field. It ensures all problems are addressed. We find that this is often a good time to, you have a dead-end street that's, terrible condition that you haven't had a chance to get to yet, or it's kind of not optimal as part of a project. You have an extra $50,000, get that extra street taken care of, get that dead-end street taken care of. Or in the project area, if you have a minor bike path that needs to be replaced, things like that, you can kind of tack on at the end and really make the most of your money. We found contractors typically appreciate the extra work, and so they're often willing to hold prices and add on that extra work for you. If conditions are tight, though, don't force it. Murphy's Law seems to always apply. If you've got $50,000 and you're trying to do $45,000 worth of work, it seems to always end up being $60,000 at the end of the day. So don't force it, but if you've got extra money, being prepared to use it is a great strategy. And then something that's often overlooked as a strategy to stretch your roadway dollars is QA testing. So oftentimes, we think of it as only minimal testing to ensure that you have the right materials, maybe 25–30% of what the contractor's testing. But accounting for not only the minimum required testing, but additional testing is a good way to ensure that your materials are meeting spec, and not just, eking over the specs, but making sure that they're really right there in the middle. So it's essentially, it's essential during late season paving, if temps are dropping, making sure that your materials are in spec. Also, planning to have the QA sub out there for more than just, hey, drop a density test on the pavement and get going. No, look at it. Are the temperatures right? Are we just meeting spec? Do we need to make plant adjustments, recommending plant adjustments? All those things are often overlooked to get the best materials for the project. They can also be useful to evaluate the base and sub-base conditions if questions arise, and it's a good way to have backup information. So from time to time, you have come springtime, a road starts failing prematurely. Hey, why is that? Well, if you've got a lot of QA testing to kind of go back on and see, hey, were we meeting spec? Was it just meeting spec? Was everything good? Were there other things at play here that caused this road to fail? So small upfront investments in QA can definitely save you large investments in the future. So I just want to leave you with these points. Consistency is key. Consistency in intent, consistency in scope, consistency in strategy, and being consistent with your public outreach. Being flexible, so remembering to mill and evaluate and not use quantities unnecessarily. And then always having a plan, being able to adjust, and really actively managing your construction project. So I know I just threw a lot at you, so I open up for any questions, funny construction stories I always love hearing, anything of that nature. It was a perfect presentation.
All right, any questions for Kyle?
You have your solid restoration issues, and how do you typically handle restoration in the field to make it more effective? We seem to struggle every year with restoration, either the side's bad or the cedar blanket didn't take, and you're just fighting every year. Do you have any strategies to make that better?
Nothing specific that I would lean on. I mean, we see that too for a lot of projects. I think being consistent with making sure that the contractors are not allowing weeds to grow, things like that, and then trying to just inform the public, getting a little bit of buy-in from the public, either watering or picking weeds or just themselves kind of keeping an eye on it can really help. I know the contractors are responsible for it, but the public giving a little extra watering, things like that, seems to go a long way to get sod to establish or grass to grow. And then just keeping consistent with the dates. A lot of times we tend to, not do anything and then do all of our sodding at the end of the year. So it can be frustrating because those people that had their street reconstructed in March and April, waiting till October to get sod is frustrating, but sometimes it means that the sod's going to grow better in the long run. So hopefully that helps. Anything else?
All right, anyone else? Otherwise, we'll come to our discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. North Aurora is located off of I-88 and Route 56. Can you guys hear me back there? Yeah, okay. So our road network is basically 77 centerline miles of roadway. Majority of it's asphalt. We have 3 state highways coming through town, 56, 31, and 25. The town surrounds the Fox River, and generally that's how development began, closest to the river, and then expanded from the east and the west on either side. We do have some arterial streets that we're responsible for, mainly Oak Street and Randall Road in town. But other than that, the county helps us out by taking responsibility for our larger arterial roads like Orchard Road and part of Randall as well. The funding sources for the Village of North Aurora are primarily capital funding. So we try to use all of our capital funding on the road program because we can avoid some of the regulations that IDOT imposes on the larger maintenance programs. I've worked in communities where you try to keep the MFT money out of the road program as best you can to avoid those regulations, but I've also worked in communities where you try to put MFT money into the contract, which is a little bit more unusual. But there's situations where some municipalities have ordinances that might be a local bidder preference, and so there might be a local bidder that may have an advantage if you're using only capital funding, whereas the state won't allow that ordinance into a contract like that, so you're saving a little bit of money by including that IDOT funding in the contract. We also do our best to apply for STP fundings, and we use our MFT to leverage those dollars primarily, and we use MFT for preventative maintenance type activities. We attempt to apply for grants when they're available. We've been most successful with CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding through the county. The DCEO grants and the ITEP grants we've been less successful for, but I think we're finding that if we do have designs ready in the queue, that they're a little bit more appealing to those making the decisions for those grant fundings.
Thank you, John. Kent?
Thanks, John. City of Elmhurst is pretty similar in a lot of ways to North Aurora. We're really bounded by a lot of state highways. Route 83 on the west, Butterfield Road, which is 56 on the south, and then we have 294 and 290 on the east, and again 290 on the north. So we're really surrounded by this network of freeways. So our community is mainly residential streets. We have 150 centerline miles, and primarily kind of similar to North Aurora, we use a lot of our capital fund, our general fund. We historically have not used MFT for roadway work, but we are now switching over to that a little bit, just because the regulations are changing. We primarily use that for salt purchases and snow plowing efforts, things like that, but we're trying to stretch that source. As far as other grants, we've been very successful with STP dollars, probably because our ADTs are pretty high, being in the eastern edge of DuPage County, and having the luxury of Waze sending everybody through our community when there's any accidents on the highways. We typically have higher ADTs compared to some of our neighbors, and that ranks us a little bit higher in some of the scoring for those STP dollars. So that's a quick overview, and I'll pass it along.
Thank you, Ken.
All right, thank you. So again, not to repeat, but it's very similar in a lot of the same ways. The Village of Montgomery is surrounded by the Fox River as well, or has the Fox River running through it, I should say. The Village of Montgomery has several state highways that run through it. That would be Route 25, Route 31, Route 30, and we also have the major county thoroughfare of Orchard Road running through our village. The Village of Montgomery is set up with 75 center lane miles of roadway. It's about 70% of that of which is residential, 30% being arterial and collectors. The village funding-wise, we have in 2014, the village passed a sales tax referendum, which was 1% on sales tax that we use in our IRP funding, which is our infrastructure road program. That is what we generally use for the bulk of our funding. However, we do alternate years with the local IRP funds with MFT funding. So each year we alternate between those two funding sources to achieve our projects. We've also done projects with SDP funds. We've been successful with that in the past. We have several of those right now that are in the queue for future projects, so we'll continue using those moving forward.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to emphasize one of the things that Mark and his shop does is have those MFT funds roll over so that you have a larger amount, recognizing that it's a burden to do an MFT project, and sometimes the amount that we have is pretty minimal. So doing it every other year, I think, is a really good idea on how to stretch your dollars. So let's start at the beginning with pavement management programs. If you have a pavement management program, let us know, and if so, how is it being used?
Yeah, our pavement management program, we kind of actually almost to a T selected a company using the way Tim described earlier in his presentation. About 5 years ago, we went out for an RFP for different companies to offer their proposals to submit their statements of qualifications that we could examine and then determine kind of which company was the correct fit for the Village of North Aurora. There are a lot of different products out there. Some have proprietary software, some have open source software. Some present various options with their software to analyze all the data for you, and then there's others that just present the raw data for you, and you can kind of do with it what you may. I've been on both ends of that spectrum in the past. Most recently, I've kind of gone back to the raw data, and we're kind of just using a spreadsheet and Excel, kind of analyzing the data on our own. I think the more familiarity you have with your own community and the longer you've been there, you kind of get a better understanding of how the pavements are behaving just from a subjective standpoint, but it's always good to rely back on that objective data to confirm what your suspicions were in the beginning. So I think the more complicated thing for the Village of North Aurora coming up with the pavement management software is just incorporating that into the overall infrastructure needs of the community as a whole. So when you're considering the pavement network, you're also taking into consideration if you have a street that's up for rehabilitation, are you doing the sanitary sewer and water main underneath that street if it's in the pavement at that time? And conversely, maybe you have had a street in town that's had 4 water main breaks and there's some patches on it, but otherwise the road's in great condition. Is that now a candidate for water main replacement, and do you have to substitute that into your road maintenance program a little sooner? So that's kind of the way the Village of North Aurora has been looking at things.
As far as Elmhurst, we started a pavement management program at the height of COVID, so it hasn't been adopted. We're kind of working through the kinks. We did the same process where we did an RFP and selected a consultant. They drove the town, and then we had a lot of issues with the data, so we're trying to work through those issues. During COVID, we had one of our engineering staff member positions cut, so obviously there was more work to be done by the smaller group of people. So we're trying to bring it back to the forefront probably this winter. It also didn't help that during COVID, we skipped a year of paving to help with the general fund, and so that kind of threw off some of our initial plan. So I would say we're at the point where hopefully we'll have one adopted in early '23, and then our staff is expecting that, or at least the consultant's telling us our staff can be trained and modify the program, so we'll see how that training goes, but definitely curious to see how it's implemented, how often we use it. Do we go back to spreadsheets, or our street superintendent driving the streets and creating their own list, which is what we had done previously. And I will say it's probably a lot of the communities here, your street superintendents are creating the list. They know the streets better than anybody else. In Elmhurst, that's how we kind of start our list every year. Our street superintendent, based on the budget, puts together a list of streets they think they can do. And one of our engineering staff members, Aaron, who's in the back row on the right there, he works as our street superintendent to kind of discuss that list. Maybe there's some mutual tweaks I want to make to group streets and neighborhoods for a little bit more efficiency, things like that. So we're a little bit probably behind the 8 ball compared to most communities in this instance with the pavement management program.
All right, so for the Village of Montgomery, we do have a pavement management program. We have a 5-year program that we roll out to our village board. Typically what we'll do is, though, we reevaluate that each and every year after our program is completed to make sure and ensure that that we're attacking the roads appropriately with the data supported, but also allowing for flexibility as things like these guys have mentioned when it comes to water main replacement or sanitary replacements, do we need to flex and deviate from that plan? So each year we come back to the village board with a final plan, even though it generally follows that 5-year outline, and just reaffirm things with them. At the end of that 4-year mark, then we typically start revisiting our next 5-year plan, start looking at data, driving the streets, again, utilizing superintendents and engineering consultants to evaluate roads to make sure that we're identifying the correct areas that we want to attack in the coming years. So that's a major part of our process that we use in Montgomery.
Thank you, guys. We see quite a diversity in experience in how they're pursuing that, and that's a great resource for you all when and if you're ready to go forward. So we talked a lot about pavement maintenance. Can you speak to how pavement maintenance is viewed in your annual road program? And if you're doing any pavement maintenance as part of your annual program, and if so, what?
We are doing pavement maintenance, but it's primarily limited to pavement striping and pavement crack sealing and crack filling. We haven't done any microsurfacing or rejuvenator or using the rejuvenator products out there on the market. I am certainly interested in those, but I think I'm kind of waiting for the state to take the lead and approve that product and let us use our MFT dollars towards that. So that's kind of the way the funding sources work in North Aurora. We kind of spend most of the MFT on that preventative maintenance as opposed to the capital funds. Everybody, I mean, a lot of communities do crack filling. So, I mean, I think in theory it definitely works. I mean, you're trying to seal out the water from getting to the base of the pavement, and you know, there's a lot to say about that. There's also sometimes, there can be some pitfalls of that when you might have the kids on their bikes riding down the streets right after the crack filling, and they're pulling it all right out of the cracks, and then you're kind of either calling the contractor back for repairs or just kind of living without to some extent. But I think preventive maintenance definitely has a role in the overall strategy for, or the preventive maintenance has a role in your overall paving maintenance plan. And I think, you know, in the long term, it's going to be beneficial to the community to undertake some of those.
Yeah, the city of Elmhurst definitely has annual dollars every year for pavement management, maintenance, if you will. We use Reclamite. We spend about $200,000 a year on that, and that's a product we've been using for actually decades now. I love pointing people to one street we have in Elmhurst where jurisdictional boundary is down the center of the road, so it's half Elmhurst, half Berkeley. When we first reclamited the street after we paved, we asked Berkeley if they wanted to, as far as I understand, asked them if they wanted to participate in reclamining their side, and I think they declined. and decades later, if you look at the street on Google Earth, it's night and day. The Elmhurst side with Reclamite has held up very well, the other side has not. So we are a big proponent of using Reclamite, and we apply it usually the same year we pave, which the residents hate. They look at you like, what the heck are you doing? But we found that the initial application in what we call year 0 is really beneficial. If we can't do it that year, we always do it the next year, which would be year 1. And then currently we, at year 5 of that pavement life, we do Reclamite again. So that's one thing we push to other communities to consider it. Certainly it's a tool in everybody's tool bag. And then we also use I'm sure everybody does, the hot crack sealing. We do in-house crack sealing ourselves, and then we do seal coating of our parking lots. We found that that's pretty low dollars, but it goes a long way with those municipal lots. The other thing I'd say that we're unique is we have about 100 tear downs a year in Elmhurst. New older homes are being torn down, and new $1 million big houses are going up, and so you can imagine what that does to your streets. So a lot of our streets look like Swiss cheese just because there's so much patching. We've decided that we're not going to push that onto the builder, so we have quality control with our patching for the new homes, so that's their utility disconnects and connections. And so we actually tack on a fee to their building permit, and the city is doing the patching in-house initially with our staff, and then we have a contractor go and do a final patch the next year to make sure there's no settlement. So most communities, you wouldn't think patching related to new homes is part of your maintenance efforts, but in our community, because you might have 4 new homes on one block in 1 year, we really truly feel it is.
Great idea.
All right, so similar to Elmhurst, the Village of Montgomery does use Reclamite as well, a rejuvenator. We, however, do that in the post-year after paving is how we attack it in Montgomery. That's been shown to be very beneficial for us. There's several things that have really worked out well for us. Number one is doing it in that year after. We allow for the material to settle a little bit to ensure that everything is in place as far as the road resurfacing project goes. So again, as you mentioned, not taxing the residents right away again in the same construction season, but again, we're hitting them right then the year after. So, but the process is pretty straightforward, pretty streamlined, at least in our experience. We haven't had too many issues with it, and it's worked pretty well. Again, in Montgomery, we use the traditional crack sealing as well as part of our maintenance program. Along with, we put in a pretty decent sized quantity each year into our program for patching work and large patching in areas to help extend the life of the roads. So those are the basis of our maintenance program.
Thank you, Mark. I recall during my time as the Public Works Director that there were some challenges in the annual road program, and it seemed like every year those challenges presented themselves, and it just seemed like it was hard to get a solution implemented in some of those challenges. And so I've asked the panelists to help us to understand maybe some of the challenges that they have in association with their annual road program. So John, can you get us started?
Yeah, I think more recently than design or construction management or anything, we've actually been, I think, having a little bit more of a difficult time communicating effectively with our residents. So trying to get the road program announcement out there early enough to let people understand what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, and also why. You're still going to get those Facebook complaints probably of somebody telling you you have no idea what you're doing and the road's fine, and then 10 minutes later somebody else is saying this is the greatest project in the entire world. And it's trying to just navigate that balance and figure out what's the right amount of communication with the residents and what's over communicating. I guess there's certain times maybe too many details is not the greatest, and at the same time not enough details can be detrimental to your efforts as well. I think the most recent challenge for us has just been the restoration aspect of a project, and it's kind of been the timing, really. I mean, the overall project went exceptionally well, and it actually finished ahead of time and ahead of schedule. but it also finished in a time when it wasn't conducive for seed to germinate or grow effectively. So while the overall project and the hardscape was completed on time and looked great, we were at a point where the seed never germinated, the weeds grew, the residents weren't, we didn't explain to the residents how much watering needed to be done, and we were kind of caught in a trick bag with that. So I'm open to suggestions if anybody has any, but we've tried to exhaust sending letters, knocking on doors, meeting, taking calls, explaining things at public meetings, and utilizing social media to the best of our efforts, but I think we just kind of keep falling behind a little bit in that area.
Yeah, I think we have very similar themes, and I'm sure all the three panelists can share that sentiment.
I guess two challenges that I would say is we try to stretch our dollars enough to get as many miles as we can paved every year. So we've been concentrating on just mill and overlays for what seems like decades. Unfortunately, lately, those streets, you can only mill and overlay so many times, and so we're falling into recons that we didn't plan for. So, for example, a street looks great from top side. It looks like it's a candidate to mill and overlay again, probably for the third time. But when we get into it, we mill, and then you have the heavy trucks on it, it starts to fall apart. That can eat into your budget considerably and cost you $50,000 to $100,000 you weren't expecting when you have to come and hog out the road and build it back up with PGE and maybe even geotextile fabric. So we're trying to be smarter about a program because really our council is not giving us unlimited dollars. They've kind of been pretty consistent, and yet we know that these recons are going to be more and more relevant, and so our mileage that we're doing every year is going to go down. So that's one thing we're really struggling with right now, and I don't think we have an answer. I would just say, surround yourself with good staff members. I have a couple of engineers here that are fantastic engineers. They have a lot of experience. I really lean on them. Also surround yourself with good consultants, whether it's from a design perspective or geotech. And in particular, geotechs are really important because if you have somebody in your back pocket you can call out on a whim and give you an opinion, it can really save you a lot of money and actually help you make the right decision in the moment. So, and the other challenge I'd say is finding interns. We usually have 4 interns that help us with our roadway program every year, and primarily they pass out notices, they help with quantities. They're not out there making all the decisions, but they are an active member of our community and showing the residents that we have people there. We're not just letting the contractor run wild. The interns we've got the last few years have maybe not been the caliber we've had in the past, and so we're really struggling with that. And the number of candidates too. It's usually we'd have 20, 30 people to pick from for 4. In the last couple of years, we're basically picking from a pool of 4 to 10 people. And a lot of them have no engineering experience, may not have any intern experience at all. So that's something we're struggling with. And even if we wanted to hire consultant REs, even on the private side, everyone's very busy and understaffed too. So our annual program is probably $4 to $5 million depending on the year, and that's a lot of work for one staff member to have on his shoulders. So we rely on those interns to help out, or the consultants if they're available. I see that challenge continuing for a while as the employment market is unpredictable.
Yes. Ken, question for you. Your interns, do you get those through the city intern pool?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we hit up the local universities all over the Midwest, and again, in the past we had no problem getting them, but it seems like the number of civil engineering or construction engineering students is down considerably.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mark?
All right, I'll echo some of John's challenges. So communication, I think, is always a tough one. For us, I think we actually, in my opinion, do a really good job of communicating. The problem is that year to year, it always differs. For example, we've had years where the village typically hosts an open house meeting that we try to do it geographically where we're going to be working. For instance, one year we hosted it in our police department, which is on the west side of town, because that's predominantly where most of the paving was taking place that year. We had a huge turnout, probably 40 to 50 people, and great success with the program as far as that year went, because we were able to get that information out. But then in years past, we've also had open house meetings where we had 1 or 2 people show up. So it's finding the avenue to get the information to the residents, not necessarily due to lack of effort on the village's part. So again, if there's a catch-all to figure out how to get the information out, I'd love to hear it, but we're always, I think, challenged with that. I think everybody in this room is. John also mentioned restoration. That's always been an issue in the past. This year, the village, we switched from traditional seed to a sod, which worked out really well for us. We had just an absolute ton of complaints last year as far as weeds and lack of germination and growth. This year with the sodding, we had little to no complaints, so it worked out well for us. But it's another one of those similar to communication where when the stars align and everything works out and the weather is conducive to it, it works well. And I think this year for us that was the case. But a big part of that was for us enforcing on the contractor and making sure that the watering was being done. We paid for additional watering to ensure that the sod established. So that was a big one for us. Kind of unique, our last challenge that I'll share is unique to our situation was, as I referenced earlier, we get sales tax referendum dollars. And so one of the issues that we're having in Montgomery is that we've caught up to a sense in our paving program with our roads that need to be resurfaced. And so our village board is now seeing where they're kind of saying, okay, where are we going to spend these dollars next? Because as far as resurfacing goes, we're at a point where we're comfortable and we're caught up. So we have some board members who feel that they want to give this money back to the residents, which is not a bad idea, but we have other projects in the queue that we'd like to achieve with these dollars. So trying to educate our board members to what other projects are coming up. As Ken alluded to too, we're trying to educate them and make sure they understand that not every road can just be resurfaced as it comes up in its life cycle. Reconstructs are going to be a thing in the future. And so we have to take those into account as we move forward. So that's one of our big challenges.
So Mark, you just helped us understand that when we meet our roadway goals, the struggle's not over, right? Thank you, Mark. I wondered, has the group tried using virtual meetings in conjunction with the in-person meetings, and how does that work?
We haven't done virtual meetings really with our residents, specifically to a capital improvements project or program. We have had board meetings during the time of COVID where we were having participation from the audience via Zoom and stuff like that, but not necessarily on a road program per se.
We also have not done it for a roadway program, but we've been doing a lot of stormwater improvements, and we tried that. I want to say it was the winter of 20 to 21, where we're still worried about the size of the group getting together. We did a virtual meeting on Zoom, and it actually worked really well. We were able to record it, post it, put it on our city website, so if somebody wanted to watch it later, which there are probably no views, but it was available. So I think there's a time and place depending on the project.
Good. Mark?
So we did similar. We did our IRP open house one year, all virtual during the COVID pandemic. So coincidentally, we had the opposite. We had very little to no participation. I believe we had one resident and 3 trustees that attended the meeting. So in that instance, it didn't work well for us.
Last year, we hosted our in-person meeting. We did not do a hybrid model. We didn't see the need for it based upon the year before, lack of participation. So we've just gone with our in-person meeting last year, or this year's program, excuse me.
Great, thanks guys. So let's cut to the chase. And this is all about stretching your roadway dollars, right? So give us your top secret how you stretch your roadway dollars. Thanks, John.
So I guess the village is pretty much stretches its dollars using leverage through the SDP funding and federal funding. So we try to take the MFT dollars, take that 20% and leverage 80% of a project and try to get the bang that way out of the money we have. I'm going to play devil's advocate and challenge the question a little bit and say, while part of it is stretching the dollar, part of it's also informing your board of the needs of the community. So as a municipal employee, you got to be out there and informing the board saying, hey, CPI is going up at a 3% rate or more each year. We're spending $1.2 million in year one, let's say, of a program, and maybe it's getting us a mile of roadway. What happens in 10 years if we're spending $1.2 million, including CPI? Are we still covering that same distance anymore, or now are we doing half a mile of a road where we could have been doing a mile? So I think there's going to be technologies out there that everybody's going to be trying to take advantage of to, whether it be operational, whether it be on the design side of things, to make design and construction more efficient. But ultimately, you're fighting a losing battle if you're not trying to maintain the same amount of money that you have in year one as you do in year 10.
Yeah, excellent points. And I think it is hard to stretch those dollars. It's only so much you can do. I think in Elmhurst, reclamite is the #1 thing we've been seeing. Dollar for dollar, it's worth its weight in gold in terms of stretching out the life of a road. Another thing we've been trying to do on the strategy side is we've been trying to select streets in groups. Previously, maybe 10 years ago, we would just select the street, didn't matter where it was, it could be one block of a 10-block stretch. We're going to do that one block just because of the condition. Well, I think recently we started looking at is if the contractor has to jump around the entire town, and our town is about 10 square miles, they're probably going to bid it a little bit higher. So how can we be smarter and group streets in a neighborhood and kind of knock out the whole neighborhood? Maybe if it's not in 1 year, but over 2 or 3, and get in and out of there, not disrupt that neighborhood for another 15 to 20 years. So that's a strategy that we've been using. I'm not sure you can really quantify how well that works, but I would say that the contractors have told us that they like that a lot better, and if they like your community, they like the way you're running it, I think they're more inclined to sharpen their pencil when it comes to bidding.
Right.
And then the last thing I'd say is we've been doing a lot of concrete streets. We've been milling them and overlaying them with asphalt, and I think it felt really odd to us at first. The huge benefit right away is it's a much smoother drive, especially when some of these concrete streets are in industrial parks. But we were worried about the longevity of the street. Are you reducing the structural integrity of the road? So one thing we did is we required saw and seals. So where the underlying joints are in the concrete, after we pave, we come in and saw and seal it, and it's been holding up exceptionally well. We have a couple streets in town where we did not do the saw and seal, and the reflective cracking is all over the place, and then it's really hard for you to do crack sealing. So I'd say saw and seal is another technique we have to try to stretch the life of the road and stretch the dollars.
Thanks, Ken.
All right, I haven't decided if it's the worst being the last, because I just rob everybody else's stuff, but, so, to touch on some of the same things that Ken just mentioned, grouping of the streets is one that we have found in Montgomery that, at least feedback from the contractors, has been an exceptionally good thing for us. Trying to geographically locate to minimize those moves for the contractor and mobilizations has been something that's key. And then also on the contracting perspective is being flexible with your contractor, understanding when decisions need to be made or they have suggestions. That we're willing to compromise and take things into account, while again, as Kyle kind of touched upon this in his presentation, of still being there to be the advocate for the village and make sure that we're getting the quality and scope of work that we want, but also giving flexibility where it comes into place, because at least in our experience, we have found that we tend to get the same contractor preferred by the village each and every year that likes working for us. They're flexible for us. Perfect example was this year we had some patching that kind of came up last minute that we needed done in a certain time frame, and they were more than happy to accommodate us even during the aggregate strike. So it was really kind of a bad timing type situation, but because we had that good relationship with the contractor, because we're flexible, it allowed for us to be able to have that where it helped us out in the long run. I can't remember the other thing that I was gonna talk about, so I'll close with that.
Okay. And we'll start with you.
Okay.
On this next round. I'm going to give you a softball. Is your street program funding adequate? Which you already told us it was, but I'm going to twist it a little bit then on you. How'd you get there? How'd you do that?
So this is perfect, because this is one that the other two communities don't have, so I'll start with this. Again, as I had stated, we use our sales tax referendum was passed in 2014. 1% of sales tax. So the idea is not only that we're putting that on the backs of the residents, but also those who come to the village and are buying goods, groceries, gas, et cetera. So we utilize the IRP funds for our infrastructure road program each and every year. So like I said, that's one of the great things that we had. So one of the things that got us to that point was we had done an evaluation, and this predates me, but this is the data that I have. We basically came up with, it was going to be a 53-year life or time period before we came back and touched a road at the current funding that we had prior to this referendum that was passed. So we have obviously had a need with the growth that Montgomery had on our west side of town. We couldn't sustain with our with our rehabilitation projects. So that was why we decided to implement this and got the backing from the board, and ultimately the residents approved and agreed it. So that has been huge for us. Again, as I stated before, some of our challenges is now, we've gotten to this catch-up point, but we're starting to try to identify other items such as sanitary lining, storm sewer projects, and potentially water main improvements that we could also use this funding. Wasn't deliberately intended and set up to be just for the roads. That's why we utilize the infrastructure portion of that. So that's how we're doing things currently, and it's working out so far.
Thank you, Mark. I want to highlight something Mark said in that 53-year cycle. And one of those slides near the end of my presentation, I gave that. And with the pavement management program, or even just knowing your per mile costs, based on what we're spending today, this is how long it takes us to get back around to resurfacing a street. And you heard Mark say 53 years. Now, when an alderman or a councilman hears that and they visualize their street 53 years from when it was last surfaced, you have a very compelling argument for why more is needed. So thank you for bringing that up, Mark. And Ken, how about you guys? How are you doing on funding?
I think we're kind of middle of the road right now. We're sufficient. We can get mileage done. I think we'd always like more money. Out in the field, we have to make some really tough decisions on, do we have an extra $1,000 on this block budgeted to do Mrs. Johnson's apron because it's the right thing to do. So I wish we'd have more of a contingency dollar amount so we didn't feel so pressured on every street. Again, as I said, we have on average $4 to $5 million a year. I live in Villa Park, Elmhurst neighbor to the west, and I can tell you the roads are a lot worse, but they did a road referendum a few years ago and they're starting to make headway. So each community is different. Yeah, I guess I'd say I feel comfortable with the dollar amount we have right now, but I think as prices continue to go up, we'll have to go back. We'll have to present some information about the life cycle and try to get them to buy into that. And that will be a little bit of a tough sell, especially these tough times where finances are still hurting at most municipalities, so we'll see how that goes.
Good, thank you.
North Aurora's been improving probably over the last 5 years, so I think just about each year our overall network PCI has been going up, and that's probably a pretty good improvement in the last 5 years. The funding has been sufficient, and I think we've gotten to the point where the actual road network is beginning to drive the dollars allocated instead of kind of the dollars limiting where we can operate throughout town. So I think a lot of the techniques that were shared today in the presentations, like the clustering of the roads and trying to find the appropriate road paving technique for a given road section are really important. I think there still needs to be as much as you could possibly educate your council or board is fantastic. The more they understand and they appreciate the roads and what you're doing, I think they're going to be more receptive to your requests. I'll try anything, to be honest with you. In other communities, like when you used to have CD players in your cars, I'd have the aldermen drive around the community in their cars with their CD player on and see where the CD would skip. And I tell them, yeah, that's probably a bad road that needs to be resurfaced. I've been to finance advisory committees where I do like the Great British Bake-Off show, and I'm not a great baker, but I've taken Rice Krispie treats and used them as a section of road to present to a finance advisory council to explain, you know, the chocolate frosting on the top is your surface, the open graded aggregates, your Rice Krispies, and then you throw another layer on the bottom, whatever you want. And while everybody's kind of eating the Rice Krispie treat, they're paying attention to your presentation, hopefully. You know, so whatever you can do to be creative, to get people to understand, you know, infrastructure is important and this is why you should invest in it, I encourage you to do it.
And I'm sure John will be happy to share his recipe if anybody wants to try. Okay, we have one more, and it's with regard to funding. And have you found any particular difficulties, or have you had any particular successes associated with accessing roadway funding? Mark, can we start with you?
Sure. Again, you know, I'll touch on the IRP fund, the sales tax referendum, but you know, the other thing too is that we're still challenged. We're still utilizing STP funds, MFT funds. So in the STP applications, obviously still working and against other municipalities that are submitting for those as well. So trying to coordinate those in the queue as far as our 5-year plan goes, along with the other applications that are coming in and the scoring that we receive on the STPs. That's always one of our struggles, is just trying to balance those and making sure that, you know, and that's probably a huge part of what I touched on earlier with our 5-year plan, why we reevaluate it each year. So we get those scores back for the STP projects and we're able to move some of those roads around depending on when we may see that funding coming along. So that's probably our challenge with funding.
Yeah, we share a lot of the same challenges, if you will. We primarily look to STP funding for grant funds. Because of the economic base in Elmhurst, we're not eligible for a lot of the other grants that are out there. And as I said earlier, because of our high ADTs with being surrounded by freeways and all the apps sending people through, don't drive through Elmhurst on a Friday afternoon, by the way. We've been really lucky on STP funding, and we have used Rebuild Illinois funds over the last couple of years to extend some, or to be allocated towards some recons that we're working on, so that has helped a little bit too. The one thing I'd say is, I'm kind of shifting gears into a separate comment, but with the grant funding, we're seeing that we need to plan multiple years in advance from what we used to. A lot of that, I think, is IDOT is overrun with processing of grant applications and everything they do. And we are concerned with potentially additional dollars coming from the federal government. What is that going to do to the strain on IDOT? So right now we're looking, when we apply for an STP project, we're asking to be on the back end of the 5-year application for our council. And so we're looking 4 to 5 years out for a project. And I feel pretty comfortable with that. But if you had a complex project that had a lot of environmental or something else, I'm starting to worry that 4 years may not be enough to get through the process if you're not on schedule and on task all the time with, again, how understaffed IDOT is and all the paperwork that needs to go through them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the position where Kent is. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I'm supporting that strategy wholeheartedly. You know, plan ahead as best you can. Identify what's unique to your community's road network. If there's something, you know, that stands out that's going to make your community more attractive for a grant application from DCEO, highlight it as best you can. You know, there's a intersection in our town that's right next to a police station, and down the road is a hospital in the neighboring town. You know, maybe that's a compelling reason for IDOT to want to contribute funding to this intersection program so that our emergency response can be more effective and lower. So it's not always unique to find or easy to find, but if you can highlight those things and plan in advance, get your designs through phase 1 and maybe into phase 2, make your grant applications as easy as possible for those reviewing them to just say, hey, this is the community that I want to support with this funding. That's probably the best advice I'd have.
Thanks, Brad. So, as Brad said, I'm going to touch just on some regulatory stuff. It all kind of stems around ADA and ADA requirements. So, first thing I want to talk about is just ADA self-evaluation and ADA transition plans is what we're going to talk about first. So, as some are aware and some aren't, it's required for all local governments to have an ADA self-evaluation plan. I think there's a lot of communities have chosen not to do this because there hasn't really been an enforcement on this requirement or something tied to it. However, I do know as part of the Kane-Kendall Council of Mayors last call for projects, you did get bonus points on your resurfacing projects if you did have ADA self-evaluation and transition plans. And it would, in talking to people at CMAP, I would think that was probably coming to other council of mayors too. So it's an added bonus. It's a way that we were able to leverage funding in the Village of Montgomery by completing a ADA self-evaluation and transition plan before the applications were due this year. So they were able to get an extra 10 bonus points on all of their applications. So it's becoming more and more important, and they're pushing it more and more. So. What it is the local agency's assessment of the programs, services, and et cetera throughout your town, and how your street network, your buildings, et cetera, are up to ADA standards. It evaluates your current facilities and programs. Obviously, your biggest one being your sidewalk ramps, typically, but also your accessibility in your buildings. It will identify the necessary changes to become compliant. And then it also, you're required to provide a way for the public to participate and get public participation. So that step one would be the self-evaluation plan. Basically, how deficient are we? How many non-compliant or compliant ramps? So the picture there shown there is a color-coded map that we created that basically numbered every single ADA ramp in the Village of Montgomery, and then labeled the red being are non-compliant and the green being compliant. So we went out and did a field survey of all the ramps and basically determined whether or not they were compliant or non-compliant. The next plan would be to come up with your ADA transition plan. So the ADA transition plan is only required for municipalities that have more than 50 people part-time or full-time. One of the big things of the ADA transition plan would be to identify who your ADA coordinator is at the village. So that's going to be the person that's going to field any ADA complaints, who's going to address and try and get back to the residents or person who might file a complaint inside your village. You want to identify what your physical obstacles are. That's usually your sidewalk ramps, or it could be, your police department only has stairs and doesn't have a ramp going up to the building. You want to describe how you're going to make these facilities accessible. So in the case of the Village of Montgomery, it was basically as they resurface the roads, they will continue to update their curb ramps and get those compliant. You want to include a schedule to achieve compliance. So you can see there is kind of a rough outline of the ramp ID, what type of crossing it is, whether it was a curb ramp or a depressed corner or had bike path, the cost, a rough cost to update that, and then what year that improvement would get done. And then that lower one is from a similar plan that we did for the city of Yorkville. It's got a little bit more detail about what the existing slopes were and a little bit more detail on how to get the ramp updated, but both would suffice. And what you ultimately come up with is a total cost to get ADA compliant. And it's just to have a plan. You don't have to have it done in 5 years or 10 years. It's just to identify how you're going to get there. And then again, you provide an opportunity for the public to participate. So these are becoming, I think, more and more important, especially with now there's extra points associated with getting funding, specifically in Kane-Kendall Council of Mayors. I wouldn't be surprised to see stuff in DuPage or the Northwest or whatever other planning council you're associated with. I do know that CMAP is doing a presentation on ADA transition and self-evaluation plans coming up, and also doing a pilot program to help people come up with their self-evaluation and transition plans, just as an FYI. The other thing to talk about is just the accessible pedestrian signals. That's becoming more and more of a popular topic and a requirement that IDOT is putting on a lot of their new traffic signals. So it's just a device that communicates information to the pedestrians, usually audibly, and then it usually has a tactile push button so that, you know, blind people can understand what's going on. An LED indicator light, you know, typically there's an information sign. So those are kind of just briefly wanted to talk about some of that stuff. So if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.